Hello, everyone. My name is Kareem Kuraitum, and on behalf of my collaborators, Florian, Travis, Wadee, Juan Camilo, and Gregory, I would like to present our paper, One-Shot Informed Visual Search in the Wild. Our work is motivated by the fact that autonomous mobile robots are currently widely used to monitor and collect data in unstructured natural environments. The main benefit of doing this is that autonomous robots can measure the health of an ecosystem repeatedly and consistently, leveraging multiple sensors in the process. And in addition, using a team of robots allows us to cover larger volumes of the ocean and perform longer duration monitoring missions compared to those performed by human scientists. As a result, scientists such as biologists and ecologists, etc., are increasingly starting to make use and rely on autonomous vehicles to sample environments of interest. The reality is that manual monitoring of marine environments and other ecosystems by human scientists is very slow and expensive and is hard to scale. The collected data ends up being sparse, both in space and time, and this is one of the key motivations behind the use of robots for autonomous scientific data collection. Robots, on the other hand, can be called upon to cover larger volumes of the ocean, and the main question that arises then is where should they look, where should they focus their data collection? And if we ask a biologist, they might tell us that they're interested in coral reefs, for example, but how can we replicate that reward function and decision-making process from the scientists on an autonomous robot? This question of where the robot should pay attention to given limited time and resources can be formulated in terms of an exploration-exploitation trade-off. On the one hand, we want the robot to collect data that the scientists know they're interested in, and on the other, we want the robot to also capture any new surprising observations and even potentially perform active sampling to minimize that surprise over time. However, in that case, it is worth noting that focusing on surprising observations does not necessarily imply that the scientist will find the data useful. So a balance needs to be struck in that way. In this particular paper, we focus on the exploitation problem and not on the exploration, which has been addressed in previous work by Yogesh Girdhar and Gregory Dudek, among others, as well as a large number of works in the reinforcement learning literature under intrinsic motivation. And more concretely in this paper, we address the following two questions. The first one is, how can we ensure that the data these robots collect is relevant and useful for scientists that deploy them in the field? The second one is, how can environmental scientists who are not expert roboticists easily specify the type of data they want the robots to collect? The first approach that one could consider is specifying a set of waypoints that the robot should blindly follow. This is kind of one of the most dominant ways in which robots are deployed in the field currently. The main problem with this approach is that the waypoints are predetermined by the user and therefore require a lot of prior knowledge on the environment that's monitored. This places the onus of where the robot should look on the user, often with waypoints being locked in before deployment, allowing very little room for adaptive sensing on the fly based on observations made in the field. So we need to go beyond waypoint navigation as the way to specify monitoring missions to allow for more adaptive behaviors online that might deviate from the specified waypoints. And that will help us enable the robot to collect data that the scientists will actually find useful directly. Another method one could use to help the robot focus its attention is semantic segmentation, by annotating all the parts of an image that are worth attending to. The limitation here, though, is a lack of scalability because of how time-consuming the annotation process can be, often requiring days to annotate a few thousand images, and even then with varying degrees of quality. Active selection of images to annotate in that way have been shown to only provide marginal improvements compared to randomly selecting images and doesn't really cut the number of required annotations by a large factor. So this method for task specification is therefore not as useful for our purposes. The solution we propose in this paper is to enable users to specify what type of data they're interested in by providing a single exemplar image to guide the robot's visual search without providing any waypoints. For example, on the image on the right, you can see two possible exemplar images, one for brain coral and one for a diver, whose selection changes the heat map of the search over the input image. It is worth mentioning that the exemplar images are not from the same scene as the input image. So in particular, if you notice, the exemplar diver image has a very different appearance and viewpoint compared to the diver observed in the input image by the camera of the robot. So the main technical challenge addressed in this paper is how do we learn representations that will make one-shot informed visual search possible with as little annotation as possible. We also showed that instead of specifying waypoints, we can provide two separate modules, one for visual navigation and one for visual search, that together will allow the robot to effectively find sites of interest. In the next few slides, we'll describe our method for how we learn these representations for similarity search. In our first step for representation learning, we start by tracking key points across video frames and extracting patches around those key points. In our case, we do this using orb feature tracking, like in typical SLAM front ends. And this step requires no supervision at all from the scientist. Assuming the videos provide sufficiently many patch sequences that depict the same key point across different viewpoints, we want patches on that same sequence to likely have very similar representations, while patched representations from different sequences are more dissimilar and farther apart in their representation. In other words, key point tracking helps us to learn similarity locally across the viewpoint variations that are found in a patch sequence. In step 2, we use a pre-trained ImageNet encoder to get preliminary representations for hierarchical clustering across patch sequences. We rely on weak supervision at this point to improve the hierarchical clustering at the highest levels of the cluster. And in the third step, we use this hierarchical clustering of the different patch sequences, and we optimize and fine-tune the embedding network of each patch using the triplet loss, such that patches that belong to the same class are said to have embeddings that are pushed closer together, and patches that belong to different classes are pushed apart, as in a contrastive learning approach. Finally, during deployment, we're given an exemplar patch image whose embedding we compute and convolve against the embedding of the entire input image, giving rise to a similarity heat map which we can use for navigation. We evaluate our learned embeddings on two underwater datasets, Scott Reef and Bellairs Reef, where we measure classification accuracy between a set of exemplar images and the top first most similar images from the dataset. We showed that the embeddings learned through weak supervision and hierarchical clustering are the best performing compared to baselines that include unsupervised learning, ImageNet pre-training, conditional VAE Latin representations, and invariant information clustering. Qualitatively, we show here that the top 5 matches retrieved using our representations look more coherent given the exemplar images used to cue the search compared to random and ImageNet pre-trained baselines. We also showed that how the similarity operator can be used for one-shot informed visual search in the ocean, in the field, in 2 different navigation scenarios. The first one involves a robot following a diver, and the second involves autonomous visual navigation without relying on humans for guidance. In this first scenario, we run diver tracking and explore human-robot collaborative visual search. So where the robot consistently follows a diver that's being tracked using its observations from the front camera and occasionally rolls to record interesting footage with its downwards looking videography camera, according to the similarity heat map computed and shown in the top right. Here's a video that shows the system in action. The robot follows the diver using diver tracking and has been given a single brain coral as an exemplar image. Once it finds a similar enough part of the input image, it decides to roll its body in a direction that will allow the videography camera to better capture the part of the scene. The robot maintains the rolls for a few seconds and then goes back into flat configuration to check out if there's anything interesting at the bottom, which in this case happens to be sand, which is not very relevant compared to the exemplar image. So the robot avoids looking at it and recording it for too long. In the second deployment, we showed that the robot does not need to rely solely on tracking the diver and can do autonomous visual navigation and obstacle avoidance, while at the same time attending to interesting parts of the scene. We demonstrate our second experiment in this video, which shows human-robot collaborative visual search. We start from the same setting as in the previous experiment, where the robot relies on the diver for visual navigation while rolling to record relevant parts of the scene. Eventually, the robot detects that the diver is moving in a direction that is not aligned with the most interesting direction in terms of content, so it decides to stop tracking the diver and begin autonomous visual navigation and obstacle avoidance, shown in the grayscale overlay screen. The red and green bars there shown on the screen represent the categorical probability distribution of actions predicted by the navigation network, which we have shown how to train via imitation learning in our prior work. Eventually, the robot finds a site of interest in a few seconds here, and it starts circling around it to attract the diver's attention. The diver sees the robot, approaches it, and rolls it manually as a way to acknowledge that he has seen the site of interest, and the robot can then continue navigation and search after the fact. Finally, we wanted to mention that there are several open HRI challenges in this domain when it comes to these kinds of navigation scenarios, including but not limited to ways for the human and the robot to notify each other of areas of interest that they may have seen, ways for the human and the robot to coordinate and partition areas to explore. All of this in the face of communication constraints, both in terms of acoustic and optical channels. As a summary in this work, we addressed the problem of more easily specifying what data is relevant to a scientist as a way to inform the robot's navigation and visual search. We presented then our weakly supervised method for contrastive representation learning that allows exemplar-based similarity search. And we showed how this learned similarity operator can be used effectively in the field where the robot navigates and records useful data in collaboration with a human diver, but also autonomously. Thank you very much for your attention. For more information on this line of work, please feel free to take a look at our other papers describing different alternative approaches and different components of the system in our RSS 2020 paper and our IRIS 2018 papers. Thank you.